Yeah.
That's a new voice. Did you guys just get a new? Oh no, it's because I'm the one who hit the button. Never mind. Sorry. Yeah, I spent a fair amount of time with Pat, and he was a good guy. Intel will be lucky to have him.
I'm sure they'll scoop up. They'll probably scoop up some of the old hires they had too. They'll probably scoop up some companies to bring them back.
Sign in. Travis, we totally screwed up. You were supposed to be invited to a meeting earlier today that we did not invite you to, and I apologize on behalf of the rest of the leadership team for letting that slip through.
Well,
and then we blamed you for not being there before we realized.
You can blame Joe, because I actually slacked him last week. I was like, is there a meeting I'm supposed to go to? And I never heard back from him. So
That Joe guy.
I know. It's all good. It's okay. It's been a crazy week anyways.
Should we get started?
Sounds good.
Stephen is unable to make it to the first half of the meeting, so I'm going to do my best to facilitate. Just remind everyone to please sign into the document. And going with our standing item, do we have any new faces today? Anyone who doesn't usually show up to these meetings? Okay, I guess moving on to the next item, release planning and updates. Does anyone want to speak to that?
I can speak to PAC. That was released earlier today. We released version 0.16.0. which has a subcommand reorganization and some improvements to the Buildpack URIs. So yeah, you should be able to get that through your typical package manager.
There was a breaking change. Was it like a breaking change of illegal ones in the first place, or was that something that just wasn't a big deal?
Sorry, could you, like, what
I
breaking
s-
change? Sorry.
I saw Cora identified something went wrong in our samples with the newest version of Pack.
Yes. That was actually an older version of Pack.
Okay.
The release, the 0.16.0 fixed what she was running into. And it wasn't so much a critical bug that we needed to fix otherwise.
Not much to add on the lifecycle front. We're starting work on the new APIs.
Since I see Matt on the list, have you had any trouble integrating the new version of the lifecycle into KPack, or has that all gone pretty smoothly?
We've released the new version of the lifecycle as a patch release in KPack just yesterday, 0.15. And we'll be releasing configurable lifecycle support in the next release of KPack, hopefully in a week or two.
My hero. Java on Tiny. We made it. We made it, Emily. Sorry, continue.
All right, I guess moving on to outstanding RFCs. I can go ahead and share my screen. I'll try to share the right one. All right, can everyone see this? All right, the first one is add image working directory RFC. I believe that
That's
was
on the
just
agenda.
open. Great. Move layer types to new table in layer tumble. I opened this RFC. We should probably add it to the agenda as well. Someone.
I can do that for you. So you keep going.
Thank you. Okay, RFC group additions to builder order.
Yeah, I have some changes I need to make to this based on the feedback from last week, but I haven't made them yet.
Great. Add lifecycle configuration file.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, it's not on the agenda. I think it's already got a couple people looking at it. I think I'm going to kind of leave it in a limbo state until we figure out the prepare spec that's going through from Joe, because it may solve the immediate need that I had when I opened that.
Added new Buildpack descriptor keys RFC.
Did this one go to FCP?
Let me check the number of approvals.
Hasn't gone yet.
I was waiting on Stephen and Ben. So please take a look. I don't think there's any required changes.
Great. The next one is CNB user research. I don't see Sam on the call today, but I can share that we had our first user interview this morning, working off of a script that was derived from the feedback given here, and it was really interesting. So I'm very much looking forward to sharing those findings and iterating on them for future interviews. So I guess moving on, RFC to create Stackify repo. Do we have Marty today? Anyone from his team?
If Emily's assigned, are there any updates, I guess, on your end from that?
I just left a fairly long review yesterday. I don't think all of the core team has reviewed it. So I'd say the update is please take a look.
Okay. For CMB user research, it looks like it has 4 votes. Is that something we can move to FCP?
At this point, I think we should consider, I know in the past we've waited for everyone to vote, but maybe we should start considering not doing that because that doesn't seem to be going super well. And this seems like a case where we might want to do that.
Makes sense to me. I feel like Stephen won't mind. Maybe we should just move this to FCP.
He has a week to read it. If he hasn't already.
I do know that there is supposed to be multiple rounds of interviews. So the first round is kind of based off of what is described in the document. But I think there's also going to be an opportunity to do more like user testing or experimentation that could also benefit from, I think, input from this group. So would that be a separate RFC to get feedback on that particular type of interview?
I don't know if it has to be an RFC necessarily. I don't know if maybe we use the actual GitHub discussion thing that we supposedly have. Like maybe that's a good opportunity to try some of that stuff out.
Yeah, I like that.
Cool.
Is this is that RFC then only inclusive up until the initial interview? Is that what we're saying? And then put it up for FCP that way and continue moving forward via other means like the discussion board?
Yeah, I was on assumptions RC was for the basically doing the research kind of more holistically. That was my assumption.
Cool. Natalie, are you able to add the labels to that one? The FCP?
Yep. Looks good.
Cool.
All right. Talked about this one. Application mixins is a draft, so we'll skip it. Stack packs.
I think this is actually ready to merge. I created the spec issues. I just need to create lifecycle issues, and then I think I'm assigned to this one. So I will merge this today.
Awesome. And offline build packages RFC.
I think this
Can we look
has
at the
all
votes? Yeah.
That's
I feel
five.
like it's ready for FCP.
Okay. Great. All right. I guess then we can move on to the first item on the agenda, image working directory.
That would be me. Okay, see if I can share my screen. I'm assuming everyone can see my screen. Basically,
Yep.
for folks that are building platforms that support things other than Buildpacks, whether they're cloud native Buildpacks or other, it would be nice to be able to set a working directory on the constructed run image at least. So that when users are execing into like made up containers or existing containers or running new containers or even copying things out, the like normal Docker commands can do that, and the platforms don't have to do anything special here in order to like copy or exec into the right place. For a little bit more background, Doku is the platform that I manage. It's an open source platform. It supports both Dockerfile and Heroku's Buildpack v2a spec. And in adding the Cloud Native Buildpack support to it, it's pretty simple. It just wraps pack. But for copying files out or for execing into existing containers, we can either hardcode /workspace or derive that from the built image. And the preference here would be to derive it from the built image, which would more or less work in the same way as like Docker files or what have you do work already. What we could, for what I had previously was a hard coding /app, which works fine for Heroku's V3 stack, but it doesn't work for like the Spring Cloud buildpacks that exist, which I believe use /workspace, which is the default. And I've also gotten conflicting information from folks in the community that are using this that say that the working directory should be /root. So if I had something where I'm like, the image says it's the working directory /workspace, then that would be what we would use. The alternative here is to, and I can document this in RFC. The alternative here is for the platform to introspect on the CNB apter environment variable, which is injected into the built run image. But that's fairly CNB specific and not something that like would be, I mean, you could fall back to Workter in every other case, but it seems kind of silly to have something that's specific to the platform when it's easy for us to just inject that property to the built image. So that's in a nutshell what the RFC is for. The change would be fairly straightforward, just modifying export in the lifecycle to set the working directory. I'm happy to make the change if other folks think it's a reasonable change. And if it's not, I'm happy to hear what I should do instead.
I can't remember why we did it as a, sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I can't remember why we did it as an environment variable in the first place. The spec guarantee is that it's the same between build and runtime, but that's exclusively the guarantee.
Yeah, I think right now,
Yeah, that's what I was asking in Slack. So it is a guarantee.
But that's only for the CMB MVAR, right? Specifically.
The guarantee is that the working directory during build and the working directory during execution of the process are the same. The mechanism for doing that appears to be an environment variable called CMB apter, or the mechanism for finding out what that directory is and was, is that instead of working directory on the outbound image, but I'm not sure why we chose that strategy for the built image.
I think the launcher right now sets the working directory. I think we still want CNB apter to be set because maybe the launcher needs to do other things with the application. It doesn't want to depend on the working directory to know where the app is, but I don't see any reason why we're relying on the launcher when we could just set it statically. I feel like this makes a lot of sense.
Would you change the launcher to not depend on CMB apter? Is that what you're also suggesting in that, Emily?
I
the last
would
sentence you said?
not change the launcher. Like if someone SSHs, someone gets a shell into the container and is in some other directory, and they run the launcher, and the launcher runs some buildpack execd script or something, we would still want to enforce the spec and ensure that those things are run in the apter, regardless of what the working dir is. But I think in addition to that, we could set the working dir so that it's a sensible default.
Yeah, it's an input to the launcher. So going along with like all the pattern that we have for all inputs, there's flag, mvar, default value, and I think we'd want to keep that anyways. I mean, the working dir thing is more of like a outside of that. Like I feel like there's like this internal and external view of it, and working dir is definitely something. I mean, we definitely want to move towards using those primitives, the same primitives that anything else in the ecosystem would use.
So does that mean that me setting that value would be fine? and I can make that PR for this RFC, or?
Yeah,
Once the
well,
RFC
so
gets
the
passed,
process
yeah.
will be, yeah, I mean, the sort of pedantic process is we all vote on it and have have time to comment on it. I think this one will go very quickly. I'll certainly vote on it today after I just give it a read through, make sure I didn't misunderstand anything. And then after it has the right votes, a majority of votes technically, but usually we wait for consensus from the core team. It goes to 1 week final comment period. And then at the end of that period, it's finalized. So, I mean, none of that prohibits you from going ahead and making the PR. We may, as a team, just not merge the PR until the RFC is in if we're being pedantic.
Yep.
But I mean, I was just this morning trying to convince Emily that we should not do that for a particular issue. So there can be exceptions, in my opinion.
Missed
fine.
an interesting leadership meeting as well today, Joe. So I'll have to catch you up. Natalie, can I get you to tag this thing with the team that it should actually apply to? It sounds like an implementation team, Emily. Is that correct?
Also, just to make sure I understand it, would this also mean that there would be a restriction or a tie between the working directory set on the OCI manifest or config file and the environment variable? Like those must always equal?
I would assume that the working directory should be the value of CMB Apter, and CMB Apter just happens to be where we store that environment variable. I don't know.
Cool.
Yeah. So like if a particular stack for whatever reason wanted to deviate from workspace being the workspace, the contract would be that they would have to set the working dir OCI manifest property to be whatever it is that their stack has. Right.
Or do we think this should actually be a spec change?
Do we have spec? We do have spec stuff around the export image, right?
I think
this
like
would
the
be a
entry
spec
point
change.
and
Yeah,
Yeah.
we have entry point stuff, so
Well-
it seems like it should be a spec change.
yeah, we can handle that part for you though. The core team will do that. So whoever ends up shepherding the RFC will make sure that an issue is open for the spec to make that change.
Yeah. Unless
Our
you want to
friend
make the
Emily.
spec change.
Yeah,
Maybe
that's
doing
true. Yeah.
It seems to pick you a lot, Emily.
I feel that way too.
It's
Uh,
broken in a good way.
Well, it's because she left the other team, so it's now just like,
So I got to get out of the platform maintainers. I feel like there's so many different ways for it to pick me.
cool. Thanks, Jose.
Thank you all.
Turnaround, given when we first saw you ask the question.
All right, next on the agenda is move layer types to new table. That was my RFC, so I'll share my screen. This one. So I had this up as a draft for a while and just marked it as ready today. So I imagine that not many people have been able to look at it. But just to give a brief introduction to what it is, this is sort of a follow-on to the opt-in layer caching RFC, whereby the logic that we use to determine whether restored layers should be reused is changing. So that Buildpacks must explicitly write the launch, build, or cache flags into layer toml. And I guess in kind of going through the implementation for RFC 52, we realized that that will be awkward for Bash Buildpack authors because the launch, build, and cache keys are currently at the top level. So simply appending to the layer toml is not going to work to set them. So to remedy that, this RFC is proposing a new table in layer TOML that would, make this, I guess, easier for Bash Buildpack authors. Simply append. Does anyone, that was a lot, but does anyone have any initial reaction to that?
So what you're trying to be able to, with a single command from bash, be able to append something. I have two train of thought. So this is only like new because there's a new meta, or like this is a new issue because there's a new metadata table that's being generated from somewhere else. Is that right?
I think it's
This
that.
is-
That's
Go
been
ahead,
around.
Natalie.
I think maybe it's helpful to look, maybe I linked to it somewhere, but the way that this layer TOML looks today, there will be a metadata table that comes first before the top, before. So sorry, when the lifecycle restores the layer TOML, these keys will be gone, right? And metadata will be there as a table with whatever data is already there. And then in order to specify these keys, you'd either need to put them at the top of the file, right? So you need to prepend them, or you can put a new table, call it whatever you like, and then set them at the end of the file.
Okay, so this table will be gone, right? Because I guess my fear was that the types table could potentially exist via some pre-processing of some sort. And then if you have two types tables, that would also kind of create a conflict, I guess, in TOML form, right? But I guess
believe-
that's
Is it,
not
or
the
does
case.
this-
TOML has a resolution strategy for that. I'm
Yeah.
99% sure it's last wins, but to reduce ambiguity, we'd expect in normal behavior that table would not exist.
Okay. And then how hard is it on Bash to prepend?
Impossible.
Is that
But yeah,
real?
it's also, no, but then you wouldn't override. So if there's a value earlier in the file, you would want the append to override the previous value in that resolution strategy.
It's
But
just
also
it's totally not convenient because you effectively have to write to a temporary file, cat the previous file to the temporary file, and then delete the previous file and move the temporary file back to that particular name. Like prepend is not a thing in the Bash world.
Yeah, it's a
You
juggling.
can one-liner it for sure, but it's pretty gross.
It's
Like
gross.
you
It's
just
a bunch
like
of
echo,
ampersands
you
compared to
echo.
one single
T.
command it.
Yeah, I think I pasted a comment on how you can prepend in Bash in the RFC.
You can't write it to the same file name while you're reading from that file though.
Yeah, you can with
Yeah, you
sed.
can. Yeah, you can.
With sed, because it stalls the whole read in sed.
I don't know if that's a problem necessarily here. It's not a big file.
I think the fact that we're even having a conversation about how to do it means that it's kind of annoying, and we shouldn't make people do it.
I mean, I was all about blowing it up and saying, the only people who write Buildpacks and Bash also contribute Minecraft to every application. But I figure we can help them out.
I guess the only thing about this RFC that potentially makes or could make things more complicated is, the potential to rename the keys while we're here. I know that that's sort of been floated previously, that maybe launch, build, and cache are not the most clearest
Oh, do you
values
really want to
use.
open that can of worms? You
Uh,
had it in the bag. You had it like this was guaranteed
Yeah.
to go through, and now it's just going to.
I commented on the RFC that I think if it's reasonable to make that change, but I think it's out of scope of this particular RFC. Like, I think it's reasonable to couple this RFC and another RFC that is just the name change in implementation wise going out together. But I don't think, given the motivation of what you're talking about, like in the earlier section of your RFC, like it has nothing to do with name changing. So it seems out of scope in my opinion.
I think the right time, I used to be in favor of the name change, started to feel like the right time to make this name change when we first brought it up 2 years ago. At this point, we use these terms everywhere, and people who are using the ecosystem are very familiar with the terms. It'd be a huge pain to change it.
Yeah, I
don't think-
agree, and I agree, and I also feel like the names that we wanted, at least when we spitballed it, were clear to us, but I don't think they add like externally to people who aren't familiar with what export and launch are and things like that. It isn't immensely more clear.
Maybe we should do that in the CMB research study to see what people think about those names.
How about I'd like to split the difference here and basically say it should not be part of this spec, or sorry, not be part of this RFC. But if we are going to do it, it's going to go in whatever the same spec changes this RFC goes into. Like we should sit down as a leadership team and say, we're going to do it or we're not going to do it. And this is our opportunity. Otherwise, we will never talk about it again.
Our job as leaders is to name stuff. Is that what you're saying?
God, we need new leaders then, because we are not good at it.
Welcome, Stephen.
So if we make the change, I think somebody brought up, maybe it was Emily, that if we, this could be a big change for a lot of people, that we'd be changing terms that are pretty widely used right now, but it's easy to make the change without breaking any build packs ever, right? Because we can just support both sets of keys for as long as we want. And if we make the change as part of this change, then we support the old style keys on the outside and we support the new style keys on the inside, right? And like, there shouldn't be a reason why, this causes friction for build pack authors. It would just be in documentation and in discussion. It could get a little bit confusing for a while. And just for reference for people, the names that we had thought of were export for launch and expose for build. Because we felt like launch and build didn't really cover the functionality of what those flags meant.
You also did store for cache.
In pack file, I did store for cache, but I don't know if I like that one as much.
Yeah.
But we could use it.
Yeah, I also commented on the names from pack file in the RFC too, so people don't have to remember.
Cool.
I'll update this RFC to call these out as out of scope. Okay.
Probably the only other thing on there was your second unresolved question. If the thing that is in scope, which is the naming of is types the right table name, is probably something I think would be good to get input on.
What I like about it is that it matches the terminology used in the spec right now. There's a little section of the Buildpack spec called layer types. And underneath it, there's build layer and launch layer. So that, I like that from a consistency perspective.
But you
There's
could
no-
have multiple things, right? Like it could be a cached build layer or cached launch layer.
Yep, your layer could have multiple types.
If people have other name suggestions, I just put that in the RFC PR.
Yeah, I don't like it, but I can't come up with anything better.
This last question about changes to the label, I suspect the answer is no. I kind of put this here actually thinking about, if we did rename these keys, then it would be very confusing to have the label have the old names. But as far as I can tell, there doesn't seem to be a requirement that this label has the same schema as the layer toml. So it shouldn't need a types, right?
I don't think it has to have the same schema. But I don't see, I guess it depends like how similar the schema is now. Like if it's mostly the same, then instead of letting them drift, I would say just make the same change to the schema. Although these labels probably need a re-schemaing in the future anyways.
think there's a slight difference right now. I think the label has data and the layer toml has metadata. But,
I have a terrible suggestion for the top level key name, life cycle. Because they describe the life cycle of the layers.
Gross.
And it interacts it's the interface between the thing and telling it how the life cycle exports the thing. But I don't think might be kind of confusing.
I'm sorry for teasing. I feel like it's just confusing because other places we use lifecycle.
Wasn't very serious of a suggestion.
right. Cool. I think we've covered everything, so I'll make those updates and please add your comments. All right, I guess last on the list is prepare analyzer to be run before detect.
Yep, this is mine. So this is continuing the discussion that we had last week on two options: analyzer moving before detect, or introducing a prepare phase before detector, with the purpose being to validate the mix-ins and do mix-in resolution and stack validation too. You know, has your architecture changed or something like that. Before the holiday break, Emily and I were working on this, and I ran into some problems with moving analyze before. That it just kind of got messy. But I talked to Emily this morning, and it turns out that it's definitely possible to move analyze before. There's some trade-offs. It makes it like sort of optimistic, like it's going to restore the toml files whether they're going to run as part of the build or not. And then restore would be responsible for just like, nope, that one's not in the group, delete it. Rather than the way it works today, which is here's the group toml for the ones that pass detection, and that's what we're going to restore. The part that was a real blocker that I was concerned about, turns out that code just doesn't run. Like there was a chunk of code that I was worried about that it gets executed for export, but based on several if statements, it doesn't actually run during analyze. So that's what made it possible to open this pull request, which moves prepare before analyzer, both in creator, or I'm sorry, moves analyzer before detect in the creator, and then deletes the group flag to analyzer. This matches this draft spec PR, which is one of an alternative with another PR I opened, the prepare phase. These are essentially identical. One is proposing a new phase in front of detect. The other is proposing switching analyze and detect. One last thing before we go into discussion, I don't think we should get hung up on like the sort of like, what is it, like the dichotomy between these two. Like the real thing that I think we know we want is a phase at the beginning that does some validation, maybe has some credentials to talk to registries, can check that you can write to the place you're trying to export to before you get to the export phase, those kinds of things. And you know, how we want to go about that is really the question. Do we want to shift some of these things around, or do we want to change responsibilities at different phases or introduce new phases? These are just some options. That's the big question. Yeah, so curious to hear what people think.
I'm strongly in favor of not swapping the order of detect and analyze and introducing the additional functionality in the prepare step. And I agree that the functionality that you want to introduce is needed, if that makes sense.
Do you feel that if we were to introduce that phase and it were to be called prepare, that it would be acceptable as a required phase, even if it were to also pre-process project toml?
Yes, I think we can. If we need to introduce another phase that does platform specific things that's optional before that phase that we don't want to run, we could do that in addition to this. Or if we want a component of that initial privileged phase, right? Because the problem is that we need now, like, kind of stepping back to what we were talking about, I think last week. To me, it seems like the problem is that we need, we have this interleaving of privileged and unprivileged phases. Some which have access to credentials and can do things that we don't want to happen during the detect phase or build phase, which need to run untrusted code, right? So having a phase that happens before detect that can run in that, more privileged mode with credentials seems like something we'll eventually always need to have, or like something will eventually drive us to that need, right? And now that we have, we have the first thing that's kind of, that might encourage us to do that, right? Instead of swapping the other phases around to avoid the need to do the interleaving that will eventually become the, I think will eventually become the architecture anyways. We might as well just keep the architecture the same, keep analyze behaving cleanly with only pulling the stuff of the detected build packs you need, right? And introduce the privileged phase at the beginning. And then if we need more optional steps at the beginning, we can do those too. It doesn't, the phasing and the optionality don't feel very related to me, if that makes sense. You can always do, phases can always do optional platform specific stuff if we need that ability, right? You can have hooks.
I agree with this 90%. The one thing that Analyze does right now that I think would make sense to do before detect is look at the previous image. Because if we're doing things like stack ID validation, previous image stack ID would matter for whether the build is sane, like whether you could take layers from the previous image. Right now, Analyze basically writes a file that has all of the relevant metadata that it got from the previous image that is used, called analyzed TOML. It also takes pieces of that and puts them in layer TOMLs for the build packs to use. But I don't think we should have to reach out to the registry for the previous image twice. And if we want to do some validation, I think we should take the part of Analyzer that reaches out to the registry and grabs metadata from a label and put that in the step that happens before detect.
But then is there any reason for Analyze to be a privileged step?
I think once you've taken that out, when you describe what Analyzer does, it restores metadata from the previous image to the layers directory, which makes it seem an awful lot like it should just fold into Restorer. And Restorer does need privileges because cache might be an image. So I feel like we should take half of Analyzer and put it in the prepare step, and the other half and put it in Restorer. And once we've done that, I might argue that we should call that first step Analyzer, because what is it doing? It's like looking at all the components of the system and analyzing them, even though it's not setting up the layers directory. But I don't care as much about what we call it. I just think that's the right organization of responsibilities.
I buy that architectural separation, as long as my only ask is that we interleave privileged and non-privileged things, and then we put the operations that need to happen privileged and non-privileged in the most obvious and optimal places, right? And so if the earlier step is going to pull the image metadata, and the later step of restoring is going to restore everything out into the file system, that step, both steps are privileged steps, and we're reaching out to the registry at the right place. That sounds great. So I think we're on the same page. So it's kind of both proposals at the same time.
What do you think, Joe?
So what parts of Analyze are you saying go in the new prepare phase?
The part where it looks for the previous image in the registry, and if it finds it, writes an analyzed.toml file that contains the contents of the layer metadata. I don't think it should modify the layers directory, but if you wrote that file right now, Analyzer uses the content of that label to write to layer TOML files, but Restorer could use the content of analyzed TOML to write the same files. Like you wouldn't need to reach out to the registry again.
Right. So it would not do this step. I don't know what skip layers is for. I guess that's an option.
It's basically so you get no inputs from your previous build, like a totally clean slate. Yeah, it wouldn't do analyze layers. So analyze layers would be like restore previous image metadata, and be part of Restorer, and it would just get the data from analyze TOML.
If we keep this functional separation, I also don't care what we call the layers. If we can combine the restore and analyze steps together into one thing called restore, and then somebody feels strongly that prepare should really be called analyze, even if it might do more than that, that's okay with me. I don't care anymore as long as the functional description we talked about is okay.
Yeah, that's really what I was trying to say at the beginning. Like, don't get hung up on whether it's called analyze or prepare. So what does it do?
Yeah. I think at least Emily and I agree on what it should do.
Okay, so the $1 million question is that that makes sense. I'm not going to write an RFC for that. I'm going to open a PR. If we need an RFC, I can do that in parallel. I also don't want to write that, but I'm really getting concerned about the velocity of stack packs, because this is like the smallest little piece of it and it's taking forever. So I don't know, yeah, I guess what I'm asking, what's next?
I don't know if the rest of, or how other people feel about this, but I lean towards, we made a bunch of decisions in stack packs that we commit to, delivering that functionality in that RFC, right? Unless somebody explicitly says they want to see an RFC out of something, then I would lean against RFC, even though it's a larger change, right? Because we did commit to implementing that functionality one way or another, and we will have core team review of the spec PR, but that may be controversial. Or
yeah, I mean, the reason I agree with that is I don't think our external users really care about the order of phases, and especially if we're talking about splitting analyze and not moving it wholesale and keeping this part after detect and doing this part before, that feels very much implementation concern. Not implementation team, but implementation.
There could be a very brief RFC about the high level, kind of movement of the names or whatever of the different phases, that goes through quickly. But I'm not saying I think that that's necessary, only that if folks are concerned that we're not giving the community time to provide feedback on the organization of the stages, then I understand that at least, but looking for other people's opinions here. Terrence, we can't hear you.
It's working now.
Yeah.
You hear me? Oh, yeah. This was brought up in leadership meeting when we're doing spec PR. But the biggest concern I had was mostly reading the spec PR. It was hard to kind of understand context without any of it and motivations behind it. Like I knew about stack packs and stuff, but it was a little harder to read the spec PR besides the actual few line changes. It was just like, what is this? Like I knew of the prepare phase, but just like goals and descriptions and kind of the stuff Steven was talking about, like high level stuff, I think was definitely missing from doing it that way. So it'd be good to actually just kind of have that stuff there.
Can someone else write that? Should I copy paste the spec PR into an RFC? Would that be sufficient? Well, in any case, do look at the spec PR because I think, well, I guess even the name, there might be something here that needs touching up with regards to the split that we talked about. But I think in general, the stack validation and the mix-in resolution will be the same. This being sort of the meat of it here.
I can take a stab at it, Joe.
Cool.
With 8 minutes left, does anyone have anything else they'd like to bring up? All right. Guess that's it.